Can you protect me, human? Asked the alien princess. She didn't understand. The gun was already in my hand before the door finished sliding open, that is. The honest truth of it, not because I heard something, not because a sensor tripped or a light changed color. My hand moved because every single day for 11 years I trained it to move first and ask questions second, and in this business, that gap between reaction and thought is the only thing that separates the living from the dead. There was nothing behind the door, just a long, empty corridor bathed in pale blue light, the way Vellard ships always were, like the inside of a cold ocean at midnight. I stood there for 3 full seconds, breathing, letting my pulse settle back to something calm, and then I holstered the weapon and turned back to face the room I was supposed to be guarding. She was watching me. Princess Savali of the Velnir Dominion stood near the viewport with her arms folded and her bioluminescent markings dim, which I had already learned meant she was unimpressed. In human terms, it was the equivalent of someone crossing their arms and raising one eyebrow at you very slowly. Every Velnir I had met so far communicated emotion partly through those markings, the faintly glowing lines that ran along their cheekbones and down the sides of their necks. Hers had been dim since the moment I walked into the room. I put the gun away and said nothing. Her chamberlain, a thin, older Velnir named Sarath, leaned toward her and murmured something in their language. He spoke quietly, the way people speak when they assume they are not being understood. What he said, translated, was this: the human is twitchy. Perhaps a request for reassignment would not offend the Alliance Council. I understood every word. 3 years of language study before this posting. I let it go. Savali looked at me the way you might look at a piece of furniture someone delivered to the wrong room. She was tall, as all Velnir were tall, close to 7 feet, with pale silver skin and long fingers and those markings that glowed faintly under emotional pressure. She wore no armor right now, just the long layered robes of her station, deep blue and silver, and her dark eyes were calculating and calm in the way that people's eyes are when they have been trained since childhood to control what they show. She spoke in standard galactic common. Her accent was precise and slightly formal, the accent of someone who learned the language from academic instruction rather than from people. You are the human guardian, she said. Sergeant Core. Yes, Your Highness, you are smaller than I expected. I had heard that before. I was not small by human standards. 6 feet, 190 lb, built by years of physical training and 2 combat tour on colony worlds that most species politely avoided discussing at dinner. But standing in a room full of Velnir honor guards who looked like they had been designed by someone with a very generous definition of what a body should be, given plasma lances and told to stand still, I understood her observation. I work with what I have, I said. She tilted her head slightly. One of her markings flickered. I had not read that particular one yet. Can you protect me, human? She asked. The question was genuine, not mocking, not quite, but not respectful either. It came from the same place a person might ask whether a small, unfamiliar tool was truly capable of that job on the label. Pure practicality. She was genuinely uncertain, and she was not the kind of person who hid uncertainty behind politeness when there was no diplomatic reason to do so. Among her Own people on her own ship, she apparently saw no reason. I looked at her for a moment. I looked at the 6 honor guards positioned around the suite, each one armed and armored and trained from birth for exactly this purpose, each one a head taller than me and significantly broader. I looked at the polished viewport behind her, showing the slow rotation of stars as the vessel moved through deep space, and then I looked back at her. Yes, I said. Her marking stayed dim. She did not believe me. I did not argue. Arguments are for people who need to convince someone. I did not need to convince her of anything. The next few days would do that work or they would not, and either way I would do my job exactly as I intended to do it. My name is Dale Core. I am 34 years old. I was born in a small coastal town in the north of England. Grew up reading paperback books about military history and strategy that I found in the back rooms of charity shops. Joined the Earth Unified Forces at 18, spent 6 years in standard combat operations on 3 different worlds and then transferred to the Protective Services Corps, which was the unit responsible for guarding human diplomatic personnel and occasionally Allied dignitaries who requested human attaches for reasons that usually had more to do with showing political goodwill than any genuine confidence in human capability. This assignment was one of those. Their Dominion and humanity's galactic coalition had been allies for about 12 years. The relationship was functional, occasionally warm, and built on a foundation of mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. The Wellner thought humans were scrappy and short-lived, and surprisingly useful in certain confined engagements where larger species could not maneuver. Humans thought they were proud and occasionally condescending, and excellent at resource negotiation. Both sides smiled in diplomatic photographs and maintained their honest assessments. In private, my CEO, Colonel Petrovane, had handed me this posting with the kind of expression that meant she was doing me a favor and I was going to have to figure out why on my own. The princess was traveling to the Orth Summit. Multifaction attendance, politically sensitive, security concerns rated at medium level. She had requested a human attaché as a gesture to the Alliance Council. I had the language, qualification, and the close protection record. Packlight medium level. I had turned that over in my mind several times during the transit to the Velsarin. I did not believe it for a second. The Velner Dominion was moving through a succession crisis that its leadership was working very hard to describe as a routine transition of governance. Savali was one of 3 potential heirs to the Dominion's governing seat. The other 2 candidates had powerful supporters among the noble houses, the kind of supporters who had historically solved political problems by making the problems disappear in permanent and untraceable ways. Summit at Orth was nominally a trade and diplomacy conference. In practice, it was the stage on which Savali intended to establish herself as the leading candidate by demonstrating competence and allied support in front of the entire galactic community that made her a target, a visible, publicly scheduled, perfectly timed target. Medium level. That first evening aboard the Vela Sorin, while Savali attended a formal dinner with the ship's sincere officers and her 6 honor guards stood at attention around her, I spent 4 hours walking the ship, not wandering, walking with a purpose and a pattern and a mental list that I added to with every corridor I covered, I learned every route between the royal suite and the docking bay. I located the secondary airlocks and noted their manual override sequences. I found the maintenance corridors that ran beneath the main halls, low ceiling and utilitarian and ignored by everyone except the engineering crew. I memorized the shift schedule of every department, and I found a relay lag in the starboard camera processing cluster that introduced a 2-second delay in the live feed from 3 specific corridor sections, 2 seconds small enough to dismiss, large enough to matter if you knew it was there. I cross-referenced the crew manifest with my encrypted database. 112 names, 109 came back without a flag. 2 had minor prior associations with Veliner nationalist factions, nothing criminal and nothing that on its own meant anything. The third was different. A navigation officer named Veloith had a brother who 14 months ago had been dismissed from the Dominion military following a scandal directly connected to one of Sealy's political rivals. The file described the dismissal as unresolved. Veloith's brother had protested through official channels and lost. That kind of outcome leaves a particular kind of mark on a family, not guilt, not proof of intent, but a mark that does not fade quickly, the kind that changes how a person sees the people responsible. I noted it and kept it where I keep things like that, in the back of my mind, where they sit quietly and wait to become relevant. On the second morning, I came back to the royal suite, the start of my shift, to find Sareth in the corridor with his composure fractured in the specific way that composure fractures when something has gone wrong and the person responsible does not yet know why. The honor guard was clustered outside the suite door in a posture I had not seen from them before, a kind of directed confusion, organized people in a situation that their training had not prepared them for. There is a technical issue, Sareth said, not addressing me specifically. The biometric lock has cycled incorrectly. The guard cannot enter. The biometric lock had locked out the entire honor guard. I looked at the door panel. The status light was blinking amber, a soft lock rather than a hard security seal. The kind of state a panel reaches when it receives a conflicting authorization signal. Possible causes: software glitch, power fluctuation, or deliberate interference from a spoofing device connected to the local network. I looked at the corridor cameras. The nearest one was in the standard position above the door. I thought about the relay lag I had found on the starboard side of the ship. This corridor was starboard. The camera was working, but the feed was sitting in a buffer, slightly delayed, currently unavailable in real time to anyone who might be watching. 11 minutes total. That was the active window. I placed my hand on the panel. The door opened. Immediately, my authorization was coded differently, a secondary protocol that the Alliance standard requires for human attaché, separate from the ship's primary biometric chain. Whoever had spoofed the panel had accounted for Velner authorization patterns and had not accounted for mine. Inside, Sivali was standing near the viewport with one hand near the small personal alarm on her wrist. She saw me. Something in her posture shifted, not relaxed exactly, but recalculated. I told her what had happened in brief terms. She listened. She asked why I had not reported it immediately to the ship's security officer. I told her because the person who sent the signal did not know yet that I noticed if I reported it they would learn that their test had failed. As things stood, they believed they had successfully practiced a method that was worth more to me than a formal report. She looked at me for a long time. After that, Sareth came in with the guards and she said nothing more, and I took my position, and the morning continued, but from that point on she watched me differently. The measurement in it was still there, the dismissal, however, had been replaced by something else. They usually become relevant. Eventually, the station called Orth 9 floated in neutral space like a city that someone had folded up carefully and launched into the dark. It was enormous, a layered structure of interconnected rings and central towers built over 40 years by a collective of 17 species who needed a place to negotiate without anyone claiming home advantage. The architecture was intentionally neutral, which in practice meant it was a strange blend of everything, corridors that shifted in scale as they moved from one species-built section to another, lighting that changed temperature and color to suit different biologies, gravity plating that could be adjusted per room and per meeting. I had been here twice before, both times on escort assignments that concluded without incident. I held no particular expectation that this record would continue. We docked at Midring Tier 4 in a berth assigned to the diplomatic delegation. The welcome was formal, conducted on the dock with station officials and representatives from 3 other delegations and a small group of journalists behind a barrier at the far end of the dock, cameras turning to catch the moment. Savali descended the boarding ramp with her honor guard in perfect formation around her, moving with the precise, unhurried confidence that royalty appeared to practice until it became instinct. I was 2 steps behind her right shoulder. That was my position, not beside her. That place belonged to Sareth, not in front. Guard Captain Velka held that space behind an offset to the right where I had an unobstructed line of sight past her to whatever was ahead and could move in any direction without crossing the guard formation or breaking the visual dignity of the arrival. The greeting ceremonies took 40 minutes. I stood through all of them and watched the room. In the 3 days since the door panel incident on the ship, I had done 2 things that mattered. First, I had confirmed my suspicion about the navigation officer Veloth by finding a way to access the ship's personal communication logs through a maintenance terminal that shared the same network as the privacy-protected crew system, but had not been included in the privacy restriction because it had been classified as engineering infrastructure, technically not restricted, technically accessible. I was not particularly proud of the method, but I was thorough, and thoroughness has its own justifications. What I found was not a direct message to any flagged political faction. It was a message to a personal contact whose registered address, after 3 layers of cross-reference through the intelligence database, led to a logistics company that had been flagged twice as a possible front for private security contractors operating in the disputed border systems. Possible, not confirmed, but they stone in my boot had become considerably sharper. Second, I had spent the remaining transit studying the publicly available architectural records of Orth, the kind released to all arriving delegations for navigation purposes. I had memorized the layout of the main Guest and diplomatic levels, I had mapped the maintenance corridor network. In my head, the hidden circulatory system of the station that ran beneath the polished floors and behind the formatted walls. I had noted the position of every docking bay on tiers 3 through 5, the location of each security post, the shift change timings published for delegation convenience, and one specific detail that had taken me an additional 2 hours of review to confirm. The Tier 4 security cluster was undergoing a scheduled equipment upgrade that would leave 3 of its 12 internal cameras offline for a 40-in-use window on the first full day of the summit. I had reported this to station security the morning of arrival. The officer I spoke to thanked me and confirmed it was a planned and known outage managed with 3 additional personnel during the window, 3 people covering a section of the station, hosting 11 diplomatic delegations during the opening day of a high-profile international summit. I thanked him and returned to my preparations. The opening reception was held in the Grand Exchange Hall, a large circular room in the station's central tower with a transparent ceiling that showed open space above and a floor so polished it reflected stars below the guests walking across it. Long tables arranged along the curved walls held food and drink, appropriate for 17 different biologies. The delegations circulated through the room and talked and were photographed, talking and said things in public that would be analyzed and discussed in private for weeks afterward, the kind of event that looks like socializing and functions entirely as politics. Savali worked the room with the ease of someone who had grown up understanding that every conversation was a performance with real stakes. She had a way of making the person she was speaking to feel that they were the most important voice in the room at that moment, which is a more effective diplomatic instrument than any formal training or rehearsed vocabulary. She spoke to the core delegation's senior representative, the Mayan Trade Observers, a consortium of independent station commerce officials, and a senior member of the station governing board who had the kind of measured smile that meant he was deciding exactly what she was worth to him. Her markings were fully bright. During all of it, I had learned enough to read her. By then, bright meant engaged, alive, present. Dark meant fear. Dim meant that she had already made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up. I was not watching her face. I was watching the room. There were over 200 people in the Grand Exchange Hall. I had been tracking movement patterns since the doors opened, building a mental map of who moved where and why and how, not tracking every individual. That was impossible and unnecessary. Tracking categories, staff who moved on patterns that matched their visible roles, staff whose movement drifted from those patterns, guests whose positioning relative to the room's exit points changed without social reason, guests who looked at Savali too often or looked at her in a specific way, the way someone looks at a fixed point they are navigating toward. At 47 minutes into the reception, 2 things happened within the same 3-second window. The hall's overhead lighting shifted by a single degree in color temperature, barely perceptible, the kind of change a person dismisses as a natural variation. I had seen that exact shift before, during a training exercise on a station with identical lighting hardware. It was the signature of a system receiving an external override command from a device that had been connected to the building's ambient lighting network, probably through a catering or service access point. At the same moment, Velka, the guard captain, took a half step to his left for no visible reason, placing himself between two of his own guards, rather than maintaining his position between the guards and the princess. Neither event on its own carried certain meaning. Together in the same breath, they carried every meaning I needed. I was already moving when the first device discharged. It was not an explosive device, it was an electromagnetic pulse unit small enough to have been transported inside a catering trolley, tuned to a very specific frequency band. The result was immediate and precise. The Vilner Honor Guard's bio-armor, which was sophisticated and powerful and designed by some of the finest military engineers in the Dominion, ran on an internal power system that operated within a frequency band that was apparently known to whoever had planned this evening very carefully. 6 suits of armor shut down simultaneously, as cleanly as lights going out. The honor guards were locked inside their own equipment. They could breathe. They could not move a single joint, encased and frozen in the middle of a diplomatic reception, surrounded by 200 guests who had absolutely no idea what was happening. The panic started within seconds. 100 conversations died at once and were replaced by the sharp rise of alarm. Guests moved in every direction. Noise filled the hall like water filling a room. Savali turned at the sound of Velka's muffled grunt of surprise and alarm, and her markings went completely dark, not dim dark all of them. It was the first time I had seen that, and it was not something I would forget. I was beside her before she finished turning. Move, I said, not a shout close to her ear, direct, with my hand already on her elbow, guiding her away from the center of the room toward the wall. Do not stop moving. My guard cannot help you right now. I can move. She moved. I will say clearly that mattered, whatever opinion she still held about my capability or my species. In that moment she listened without hesitation. She made that choice instantly and did not revisit it. Whatever royal children were trained to do in crisis, she had been trained to function, and she did. 4 attackers came out of staff positions along the far wall, moving with the coordinated precision of people who had walked this exact sequence in rehearsal. 2 cut off the main exit. 1 began a wide arc to the left, angling for the secondary door at the room's 300 position. 1 remained completely still, standing still. In a situation like this means one of exactly 2 things: hesitation or command. This person was not hesitating. He looked at me, I looked back. There was a pause, a single breath where his calculation visibly adjusted. He had planned meticulously for the honor guard. He had not fully accounted for the human attaché standing 2 steps behind the princess's right shoulder. I could see the recalibration happen in his eyes. I used that pause. I pulled Savali behind the nearest large catering station, the kind with heavy alloy legs and a solid alloy surface that would slow most projectiles at the angles he could currently reach us from, and I assessed the room's geometry with everything I had. Main exit blocked. Secondary door at 900, too far with the crowd. Secondary door at 300, closer. The circling attacker was moving toward it but had not reached it yet. We had about 12 seconds before that window closed entirely. I need you to run when I say run, I told her, keeping my voice level and low, not before, not after. When I say it, you go straight for that door at 300 and you do not stop. I will be directly behind you. She looked at me. Her markings were dark, but her voice was entirely steady. Understood. I fired twice at the ceiling, directly above the circling attacker, not at him. Above him, at the recessed lighting housing, the units came down in a shower of sparks and hot components, and a sharp burst of white light. Reflex is not a species-specific trait. He flinched and pulled back one step. That was all I needed. Run, I said. We ran for the door. The 300 corridor opened ahead of us, and we were through it before anyone in the hall had finished processing what had just happened. I had the tunnel layout memorized. Left turn first, then the third maintenance access panel on the right side, then down into the service network that ran beneath the guest levels. I had walked this route in my imagination 100 times over the past 3 days. Now I walked it in reality. My left arm registered the graze of a directed energy discharge while we were still in the main corridor. Low power, aimed to stop rather than to do lasting harm. It scored across my outer arm like someone had drawn a line of heat across the skin. I registered it, categorized it, and kept moving. The pain told me the range, the angle, and the approximate position of the shooter behind us. It did not tell me to slow down. Pain has never told me anything that useful, and I stopped consulting it for directional guidance. Somewhere in my second year of service, Savali ran with the long, efficient stride of her species. She did not panic, did not slow, did not ask questions while we were in motion. I noted that too and filed it. The maintenance access panel was exactly where I had memorized it. I pulled it open, guided her through, followed and sealed it from inside. The service tunnel was narrow and dark, smelling of recycled air and the faint metallic warmth of the station's machinery running on the other side of the walls. I switched on my personal light and we moved quickly through the low sailing corridor, crouching under conduit runs, navigating by the map I had built entirely in my head from records I had read on a screen 3 days ago. She said nothing for 30 seconds. Then she said they targeted the guard armor specifically. Yes, that requires precise knowledge of military hardware frequencies. That information is classified at the highest Dominion level. Yes, someone on the ship provided it to them. That is my belief. Another silence. We moved left after the third junction, straight for 60M, right at the large coolant pipe that I had noted in the engineering diagrams as a consistent landmark, because it was the only one of its diameter on this level. You knew this was going to happen, she said. It was not exactly the same statement she had made on the ship 2 nights ago. That one had carried surprise and the edge of accusation. This one was quieter, sitting differently in the air. Between us, something was arriving in her thinking that had not been there before. I knew something was going to happen, I said. I did not know the specific shape of it until about 47 minutes into the reception, but you prepared for it anyway before you knew. That is the job. She was quiet again for a moment, and then she said, you memorized these tunnels? Yes, from the navigation records, from the publicly available architectural release provided to all arriving delegations. You studied the emergency vessel pre-clearances, she said it was not a question. I study everything above us. Distant but building, I could hear the stations. Alert systems beginning to cycle up. Through the levels, voice announcements. In 6 languages, the sound of running. Boots on the floor above, station. Security mobilizing in response to the incident in the hall. Good, they would cover the open spaces and make the attackers move faster, which would push them toward the exits, which meant they would consolidate rather than spread. 2 sides of the same calculation, but the net result was that they were no longer entirely controlling the timeline. Where are we going? Savali asked. Docking Tier 3 Berth 7, their diplomatic pool maintains an emergency vessel there with pre-cleared departure authorization for any senior delegation member. It was in the records you provided to the station on arrival. Silence. Then you looked up our emergency vessel authorizations. Yes. Why? Because if I ever needed to move you from the station quickly and every standard exit was compromised, I needed to know which non-standard exits existed and whether they had pre-authorization or would require a clearance request. Under time pressure, she did not say anything for a moment. Then that is very thorough. It has kept me alive, I said. More importantly, tonight it is going to keep you alive. The tunnel opened into a wider maintenance bay at the junction of Tiers 3 and 4, equipment racks, storage units, the background hum of life support machinery. I checked the bay before we crossed it. Clear. We moved the access corridor for Tier 3. Docking was 60 m of straight passage. Ahead of us, at the far end, Berth 7, I heard them before we came around the last bend. Footsteps in the corridor, measured and unhurried, coming from the other direction. Someone had gotten ahead of us. Either the station's corridor layout had been predicted precisely, or there had been a second team I had not fully mapped. 4 figures came around the bend and stopped. When they saw us, we stopped too. Corridor was narrow. The overhead lighting was the older fixture type with a physical emergency shut off on the panel beside the nearest door on the left wall. The berth door was behind the 4 figures. See, waiting for Seely's biometric authorization to open. We needed to reach it, Savali said quietly. At my left. There are 4 of them, yes. And one of you, yes. A pause. That is unfavorable math. I looked at the corridor, the width, the ceiling, the equipment lockers, the lighting panel, the distance, the spacing between the 4 figures, and the angle at which the command figure, the one who had stood still in the hall, was positioned. The math is manageable, I said. She looked at me. How they are in a narrow space and can come at me 2 at a time at most. The lighting gives me a controllable variable, and none of them have ever met a human who made a promise and kept it before. I took a breath. Stay behind this corner until I tell you to move. When I say move, go straight to that door and put your hand on it. She nodded once. The first figure started toward us. I went to meet him. The first one came fast, which told me he was confident and not patient. Fast is a good quality and open ground with room to build momentum in a narrow corridor against someone who has already decided exactly where they are going to place their feet and what they are going to do. When they get there, fast is just a way of arriving at the problem before your own thinking catches up. I sidestepped left. His shoulder hit empty air where I had been. I let his momentum carry him forward and redirected the rest of him into the wall with a technique I had practiced on pads and in live situations, enough times that my body executed it. Without asking me, he hit the wall hard. He went down. I did not wait to see him. Stay down because confirmation is for reports, and this was not a report. I was already looking at the second one. The second attacker was smarter and had held his position, trying to use the distance between us to get a clean aim with a directed energy sidearm he had drawn. Distance is usually the right call when you have a ranged weapon and your opponent does not. The problem for him was the 8 seconds it took him to acquire a stable aim in a situation where his hands were probably not as steady as he wanted them to be, and the problem for both of us was that I was not going to give him those 8 seconds without charging the variable. I crossed to the lighting panel on the left wall. It was exactly where I had seen it when I looked at the corridor 30 seconds ago, before anyone had started moving, because looking at rooms is what I do, and I cannot stop doing it even when I am also doing something else. One hit muscle memory. The lights went out. In the dark, the body aims for where it last saw movement. I was not where it last saw me. The principle is simple and reliable. In genuine darkness, in the specific high-pressure state of a real engagement, the human eye fixates on the last known position of a threat, and the hand follows the eye. This is not a failure of training, it is biology. The deep quick circuitry of a nervous system that developed over millions of years in an environment where light sources were sun and fire and nothing else, where movement in the dark was something to track and track hard. You can build on top of that biology with training. You cannot remove it. Even very good opponents trained in low light conditions have a moment of tracking the last position. I needed that moment. I used it. I was not where it last saw me. I was moving on a line I had already committed to, counting steps in the dark. Because in a real engagement, the adrenaline running in my body elevates almost everything except the count. The count is different. It sits below the elevation in a part of my training that goes deep enough that it runs independently of whatever else is happening at the surface. I was moving on a line I had already decided on, counting steps in the dark because the adrenaline that runs in a real engagement elevates everything in the human body except the count. The count stays. I trained in darkness enough times and in enough different kinds of darkness that the count has become something underneath the rest of my thinking, running quietly on its own, whether I tend to it or not. At step 19, I was under his arm. The weapon came out of his hand. He did not keep it. I moved it out of the immediate area with a throw that sent it bouncing down the corridor, because a weapon on the floor in the dark is a problem for whoever finds it, and I would rather it not be found easily. In the next 30 seconds, the lights came back after 8 seconds. Station safety systems do not allow manual overrides in occupied corridors to hold longer than that. I had known this. I had accounted for it. The lights returning told me my available window was at its end, which was fine because I had used the window for what I needed. The third attacker was larger than the other two, larger than most things I had gone against in a real engagement. Kind of large where the instinctive training response is distance, using reach as a weapon in reverse, staying outside the grab window and making the larger body work to close it. There are Entire schools of close proton training. Built around this response, they are correct in environments where you have room to maintain distance. I did not have room. The corridor was exactly wide enough for two people standing side by side with their arms at their sides. There was a wall on the left and a wall on the right and a ceiling above and a floor below and a very large attacker directly ahead of me, and the only direction I was not prepared to go was backward. I went toward him below the reach window, which exists at a specific height relative to shoulder width and is universal across most body plans because it is a function of geometry rather than species. Past the instinctive defensive adjustment that larger bodies make when something smaller and faster moves directly at them at floor level, because that kind of approach does not match the training most large bodies receive, and uncertainty produces a half-second hesitation into the gap beside his leading knee, and I put force at the specific angle and specific vector into the joint that collapses it regardless of what is built above it. Knees are knees. Carbon-based structural biology does not vary enough at the knee joint for mass to protect it from correct leverage. The physics involved is not species specific. The joint gives the same way whether it belongs to a human or a Vellner or any other upright walker who has been constructed on the same basic structural principle of load-bearing skeletal joints supporting a vertical body. He went down. There is a moment in every real engagement, one that does not exist in training. The noise of the situation drops away, and you become very quiet inside, not calm exactly because your heart is running and your body is hot, and the particular chemical urgency of genuine danger is present in every cell, but quiet in the sense that everything unnecessary stops competing for your attention. There is the problem and there is the solution, and there is nothing else. 11 years of training built me toward that moment, but the moment itself cannot be manufactured. It only arrives in the real thing when the real thing is happening and the real cost is on the table. I had been in that quiet place for the past 43 seconds, since the moment I first understood what the light shift in the reception hall meant in the maintenance tunnel. It had been there in the corridor outside the berth. It was fully present, every movement since the moment of the assault had come out of that quiet, and the quiet did not care about the burning in my arm or the noise of the alarm systems above us or the fact that I had a cracked rib forming on my right side and would need to be aware of it. The quiet said one more. I had taken his arm on the way down from his attempt at a counter grab, and the contact between his elbow and my right side was a reflex on his part, an involuntary spasm of a body that was going down but had not finished fighting. Yet bodies do not stop the moment the conscious decision to fight is removed. They continue for a second or two on the momentum of the last instruction they received. I knew this, and I did not take it personally. I moved back out of range of the secondary contact, and I let him finish going down. His elbow caught my right side in the brief window before I cleared the range, a reflex rather than an aimed hit, and it connected with enough force to tell me immediately that I had at least one cracked rib to think about later. I noted it and moved on. Later is later. Right now was right now. The fourth figure had not moved during any of this. He was still standing in the same position, 15 ft from the door, watching everything that had happened in the past 40 seconds with an expression that had started as professional confidence and was currently in the process of becoming something else, not fear. I did not think he was afraid. He was recalculating the way someone recalculates when the model they were operating on turns out to be missing a significant variable. The variable was me specifically, and specifically what I was willing to do when the person I promised to protect was behind a door I needed to reach. I was breathing hard. My arm was burning from the earlier graze. My side hurt with the specific quality of hurt that comes from structural damage rather than surface damage. My hands were steady. My thinking was clear. I had learned in my second year of service that pain and function are separate systems in human body, and they do not automatically affect each other, and I had spent 10 years since then reinforcing that, learning every time the opportunity. I looked at him, he looked at me. The door behind you, I said, move away from it. He did not move immediately. He was making a decision, and I let him make it without rushing him, because rushing a decision in a person who is still armed produces a different outcome than giving the decision room to resolve on its own. I kept my position, kept my breathing measured, kept my eyes on him without aggression and without softness, just steady contact that communicated that I had already decided what happened next, and the only variable was how much he wanted to complicate the next 30 seconds. He looked at his 3 colleagues on the floor. He looked at me. Again, he took 3 careful steps to the side. His movements were slow and deliberate, controlled, the movements of someone choosing to yield rather than being forced to yield, and I understood that, and I let him have the distinction because it cost me nothing, and it reduced his reason to escalate. He looked at me for a long moment. His calculation was complete. I could see that he had run the numbers on the situation and arrived at the correct answer, which was that the numbers were not in his favor and had not been since the moment his 3 colleagues went down in a corridor that he had expected to be adequate for the task. People who plan these things do their planning from a specific model. They build the model on known quantities, available intelligence, reasonable projections. The model for tonight had included the Vellner bio-armor vulnerability, the precise composition of the honor guard, the camera outage window, the layout of the station's Tier 4 level, and the expected response time of station security. It had included me as a minor variable, a human ceremonial attaché, a role that the Dominion used for political signaling rather than genuine security. The model was not wrong about most things. It was wrong about one thing, and the one thing it was wrong about had made everything else irrelevant. He took 3 careful steps to the side. His movements were deliberate and controlled, the kind of yielding that makes a point about the choice being voluntary. I understood the point, and I let him make it because it cost nothing and it reduced his incentive to create a new problem in the next 30 seconds. While Saley was reaching the door, I did not turn my back on him. I spoke to Say without moving my eyes from his position. Biometric authorization. Now she stepped out from the corner at my instruction and walked directly to the berth door. Without slowing down, without looking at any of the 4 figures, without any detour or hesitation, she placed her hand on the panel. The door opened. Immediately, the emergency vessel was exactly where the record said it would. B. Small, functional, the kind of craft. Designed not for comfort, but for departure, its running lights at low standby and its systems humming quietly. In the dark of the docking berth, I backed through the door without taking my eyes off the fourth attacker until the door was between us. I sealed it with a manual emergency lock, a physical bar mechanism that would take station security tools to open from outside and would hold against everything these four were carrying. Inside the berth, the sound of the station's alert systems were reduced to a low background pulse, muffled by the docking bay walls and the insulation of the berth itself. Ciali stood near the boarding ramp, and she was breathing faster than I had heard from her before. Her markings were returning slowly, the way a room fills back with light when the source is restored. Starting at the edges and working inward, she looked at my arm at the cut above my left eye, which I had not precisely registered acquiring and could not identify the moment it had happened, at the way I was holding my right side, because the rib required a small accommodation and posture that she apparently noticed immediately. You are hurt, she said. Functional, I said. Those are not the same thing. No, but functional is the thing that matters. Right now, I moved to the vessel and started the boarding checks. Fuel status, system integrity, emergency transponder activation, departure pre-clearance already in the station system under her diplomatic authorization. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, because I had checked it would be before I ever needed to use it, which was the whole point of checking. She followed me aboard and took the co-pilot seat without being told, which told me something about her. The natural response when someone experienced leads you through an emergency is to follow their lead entirely. The natural response when someone competent is handling the technical work is to stay out of their way. She did both of those things by taking the co-pilot seat, which was out of my way but within reach if I needed a second set of hands, which was the correct tactical position, and she found it intuitively in the hall. She said, while I ran the pre-launch sequence, you fired at the ceiling above him instead of at him. Directly, he was positioned at an angle where a direct shot intersected the crowd along the far wall. The ceiling fixture was a safer choice that produced the same result. You calculated that in under a second, probably faster. How does a person think that quickly under those conditions? I finished the sequence and looked at her for a moment. When I took this assignment, I reorganized how I think, not my own outcome first and then yours first and only. What is the threat to you? What is the exit for you? What does a mistake cost you? When the framework is built that way, every decision runs faster because there is only one answer worth finding, and everything else is removed from the calculation. She was quiet for a moment. Her markings were at about half brightness. My people describe humans as a self-interested species, she said. Every briefing document I have ever received about your people contains that description. Self-preserving, cost-calculating, useful when interests align. I know you are not matching that description. Briefing documents describe what statistics predict. I said they do not describe what a promise does to the person who made it. The launch sequence completed, the vessel lifted, the berth doors opened on the pre-clearance authorization, and we came out into open Space, the vast ring structure of Orth, fell slowly away behind us, still fully lit, its emergency beacon pulsing steadily on my instruments, the station going about the serious business of responding to what had just happened. Inside it, I set the autopilot on, intercept for the Vellner carrier, and checked the instruments and let the quiet of open space settle around us. The stars were very old and very steady, and they did not care at all about the various urgent and important things happening at the scale of two small people in a small vessel far below them. I checked the emergency transponder. Active and broadcasting, the carrier was responding, 42 minutes to contact. Savali sat in the co-pilot seat and looked out at the stars. Her markings were at about half brightness still, slowly returning to full. For a while, neither of us said anything. The vessel ran quietly. The instruments reported nothing that required attention. The space between us and the carrier was empty and calm. Then she said, "There was someone on the ship." "Yes, the navigation officer, I believe so." "You suspected him before we arrived at the station." I identified a possible connection. "I did not have confirmation, but you prepared as if the threat were real, regardless of whether you had confirmation." "Suspicion is not proof," I said, "but it is also not nothing." I treated it as worth preparing for while continuing to look for evidence. She was quiet again. "When did you know for certain when the armor frequency was used in the hall?" "The specific frequency used to disable bio-armor is classified at the Dominion's highest military level. The number of people with legitimate access to that information who were also aboard the Vila Sarin during transit is small. The number with a personal motive is smaller. Dominion intelligence will confirm the specifics through the investigation, but the direction of the evidence was clear. Within seconds of the armor going down, she nodded slowly. She had the focused expression of someone processing multiple things simultaneously and organizing them into an order that would be useful later. "He will be found," she said, not a question, "in the house behind this." "Yes. The contractor team at the station is already being held by station security. The chain leads back." "It always does. Does that satisfy you?" she asked, knowing it will be resolved. I thought about the question. "What satisfies me is that you are on this vessel and not on that station. The rest is important, but it is other people's work." She looked at me for a long moment. "My guard captain," she said. "Vila physically unharmed. The armor locked down as a frequency effect. Remove the signal and the armor restores. Station security will have the key from the device within the hour. He will be out and functional." "He will be upset about what happened." "Yes, he will be upset about the specific fact that a human attaché accomplished something his formation did not probably." She was quiet, then carefully, "He will have to find a way to work with that. He is a professional." I said, "Professionals find ways." The stars moved across the viewport in the slow, patient way that stars move when you are in a small vessel in normal space with nowhere urgent to be for 42 minutes. Savali watched them and said nothing for a while. "I did not expect this," she said. "Eventually, the attack you." She looked at me. "I have had human attaches in diplomatic contexts before, ceremonial roles, photo events, alliance courtesy functions. They were competent people doing a formal assignment. This was different. The assignment was different. The assignment was rated medium. Security, you treated it as something else entirely. I adjusted the course. Slightly, a minor correction the autopilot had flagged, I disagreed with. The rating, you filed a note which changed nothing officially, which changed my preparation. I said the official rating determines the resources allocated to an assignment. It does not determine what I do with the resources I have. She turned to look at me fully. That is a very specific way of thinking about authority. It is a practical way. I said authority sets the frame. What happens inside the frame is still my responsibility. The rating said medium risk. My read of the political situation said higher. I could not change the rating. I could change what I did every hour of every day between getting the assignment and arriving at that station. And if you had been wrong, if the threat had never materialized, then we would have arrived at Orth and attended the summit without incident, and I would have come home with a very thorough knowledge of the station's maintenance corridor layout that I would never use. A sound came from her that I had not heard before. It was brief and quiet, and it took me a moment to identify it as the Vellner equivalent of short laugh. Not performed, genuine, the kind of sound a person makes when something resolves into a shape that is both correct and unexpected. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want an honest answer. Yes, when I asked you on the ship whether you could protect me, and you said yes, was there any part of you that was not certain? I thought about it. The honest answer required looking at the moment clearly without revision. There was no part of me that was not certain of my intent. I said, whether I was certain of the outcome is a different question. I was not certain what the threat would look like or when it would come. I was not certain I would not be hurt. I was not certain everything would work, but I was completely certain that I would do everything I was capable of doing for as long as I was capable of doing it. That is the only certainty I had to offer, and you considered that sufficient. I considered it the only thing worth being certain about. The outcome is never fully in my hands. The effort is. She was quiet for a long time after that. When the carrier came into visible range 29 minutes later, she said one more thing before the docking approach occupied both our attention. I have decided, she said, that I was asking the wrong question entirely when we met. I was asking about capability when I should have been asking about intent. Those are not the same thing, and for your species, I think the second one matters more than the first. For most species, I said, they are not connected. A person can intend something and fail. A person can be capable and choose not to act. She said, but for you the connection between intent and effort is apparently not optional. Once the intent is established, the effort follows completely. That is the part I did not understand. The carrier filled the viewport ahead of us. I ran the final docking sequence. That, I said, is the part that matters most. The stars were very old and very steady, and they did not care at all about the various urgent and painful and important things happening at the scale of two small people in a small vessel beneath them. I checked the instruments. The Vellner diplomatic carrier was responding to the emergency transponder. Intercept course set 42 minutes to contact. I adjusted course to meet it and set the autopilot. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then Savali said there was someone on the ship. The navigation officer, you suspected him. It was not a question. You did not report him. I had suspicion and inference, not evidence. A formal report on that basis would have warned him and potentially others before I had anything concrete. When did you know for certain? When the armor frequency was used tonight. The armor systems are classified. The only people outside the Dominion's highest military offices who had access to the vessel during transit were crew. The specific frequency used narrows the source considerably. Station security will confirm it during the investigation. She nodded. Her markings were fully bright. Again, now steady and even. She looked out at the stars for a long time. In the tunnel, she said, eventually you told me that you disagreed with the medium security rating. Yes, you filed a note, which did not change the official designation, but you prepared as if the rating were maximum risk. Yes. Why? Her voice was different from how it had been at any point during the 3 days since I had boarded her ship. The measurement in it was gone. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to understand, not because she was evaluating. You could have done the minimum the assignment required. You would not have been faulted for it. No one expected more from you. I watched the stars move across the viewport at the slow pace of a vessel in normal space. You asked me a question when we first met. I said whether I could protect you. I said yes. Once I say yes to something like that, the minimum required by the assignment becomes irrelevant. What becomes relevant is every possible thing that could go wrong and whether I have done everything in my ability to prepare for it. That is not about the rating. It is about the answer I gave. She turned from the viewport and looked at me directly. Her markings were at full brightness, all of them, including the ones along her jaw that I had rarely seen lit before. A promise, she said. Yes, for humans, a promise is not a formality. No, it is a decision. Once made, the outcome is not negotiable. That is one way to say it. She was quiet for a long moment. The rescue beacon on my console pinged the first acknowledgement from the carrier. I made the notation in the flight log. I asked you the wrong question, she said. I glanced at her. When we met, I asked whether you could. That is a question about physical capability, about whether your body and training are sufficient given the variables. She paused. The question that actually mattered was whether you would, whether the promise itself carried weight, whether the word yes meant something beyond the moment it was spoken. She looked at the stars. For you, the answer to would was never in question, was it? No, I said it was not. She nodded very slowly with the deliberate movement of someone's son settling into a conclusion they have been arriving at for some time. The carrier came into visible range 29 minutes later. We docked smoothly. There were people waiting, diplomatic staff and security personnel, and a Dominion medical officer who looked at me with an expression of professional alarm and began immediately trying to direct me toward a treatment room. I let him, because the arm and the side both deserved attention, and I had enough experience to know that the moment after a crisis is not the time to dismiss injuries as manageable. Cavalli watched me being guided toward medical from across the docking bay. Her markings were still fully bright. She did not look like someone who had just survived an assassination attempt. She looked like someone who had learned something that she was still in the process of integrating. Before the door closed between us, she said loudly enough to Carrie, I will be requesting your permanent assignment, Sergeant Corps, not as a diplomatic gesture because I want you specifically. I looked back at her. Then I will be there, I said. The door closed. I sat down on the medical bay table and let the doctor work, and I thought about nothing in particular for a while, which is a technique I developed years ago for the hours immediately after a crisis, when the body needs to come down from what it has been running on and the mind needs a moment of silence before the debrief begins. We docked smoothly in the bay. Lights were bright after the dark of open space. People were waiting at the bay doors, diplomatic staff and a Dominion security official and a medical officer who started toward me immediately with the focused, professional expression of someone who could assess injury from 20 ft away. Savali descended the boarding ramp ahead of me and was immediately surrounded by her staff, people who had been standing in this bay for as long as we had been in open space, waiting and managing the constant flow of information from the station and the carrier's communications team and the layers of Dominion government that were all currently focused on the same single question of where the princess was and what state she was in. She was in excellent state. I was the one the medical officer was steering toward a seat. I have functional injuries, I told him. I can see that, he said. Come with me. I went. The arm needed proper care. The rib confirmed cracked, 2 of them, which explained the quality of discomfort that had been present since the corridor. The cut above my eye was minor. I sat on the medical bay table and let him work. There is a specific kind of quiet that arrives after an operation ends, not the narrow combat quiet I described earlier. This is different, the quiet that come cream when the focus state releases and the body begins its accounting. Everything deferred in the service of function starts arriving in sequence as the body works through what just happened to it. I have learned not to resist this process. The body doing necessary work deserves the space to do it. The medical officer finished and left me with a list of things to attend to in the longer term. I thanked him. He left. I sat alone. Through the bay's far window, I could see a wedge of open space and the slow turning of the nearest ring section of Orth, its emergency beacon still pulsing. The station going about the serious work of accounting for tonight. Someone knocked. I said, come in. It was Siali. She had changed out of the diplomatic robes, wearing the simpler traveling clothes of a person who was no longer officially on display, and she was alone. She came in and sat down beside the bed with the deliberate care of someone who had decided to do this and was not leaving until it was done. The navigation officer has been taken into custody, she said. Dominion intelligence is en route. The contractor team is being held by station security. The investigation is underway. Good, I said. It will take months to complete the formal case. The Noble House connection will be proven, but the process is slow. A pause. My political position in the meantime is strengthened. Surviving this publicly, visibly, with the response I intend to make puts me in a better position than before tonight. The people who planned this made an error. I said, yes, they intended to demonstrate vulnerability. They demonstrated the opposite. She looked at my arm and my eye and the way I was sitting carefully. Because of the ribs, because of you, she said. Because of the work, I said. I was the instrument tonight. The work itself is what mattered. The preparation was not generic work, she said. It was yours. Another officer might have done some of what you did. I do not believe another officer would have done all of it in the way you did it, with the particular orientation you brought to it. I did not argue with her. The argument would not have been entirely honest. We were quiet for a moment, then she said, I want to understand something about you that I have been thinking about since the tunnel. You said you were afraid in the tunnel. When I asked, you said yes. Yes, but you kept moving as if you were not. Those are two separate things. I said, being afraid and being stuck by it. I have been afraid in the field more times than I could count. Fear is information. It is the body telling you that the stakes are real and that the situation is dangerous. That information is useful. The fear is not the same as the instruction to stop. Those are only the same thing if you decide they are. She was quiet for a moment. Where I am from, she said, the word for courage in its oldest form means the same as the phrase for being without fear. The oldest Wner concept of bravery assumes the absence of the fear response. That is one way to define it, I said, and yours. Mine is feeling the fear and moving anyway. I said, not removing the fear, carrying it with you while you do the thing. I think that is more honest to what the situation actually is. The situation is genuinely dangerous. Fear is the correct response to that. Pretending the fear is not there is not bravery. It is bad accounting. She looked at me for a long time. You are going to change things here, she said. Not intentionally, but the things you think and the way you think them are going to change how people in this house think about certain questions. I want you to know that I am aware of that, and I consider it a benefit rather than a problem. I will try not to be disruptive, I said. Be exactly as disruptive as you need to be, she said. That is not a courtesy instruction. It is a sincere one. She stood and moved to the door, then she stopped. I will file the permanent assignment request tonight. I want it in the formal record as early as possible. I will be there, I said. She left. The door closed. The bay was quiet and still. Outside the viewport of the carrier, the stars were the same as they had always been, very old, very patient, completely indifferent to the small and urgent lives burning brightly in the dark between them. That is fine. We are used to that. Humans have always burned brightly in the dark and asked nothing from the dark in return. I am sitting now in a medical bay on the Vellner home world, which is called Velen, and which is extraordinary in the specific way that worlds are when you encounter them for the first time and understand that the universe has been building them quietly for billions of years without your awareness, and will continue doing so long after you are gone. It is a planet of long twilights and warm inland seas that glow faintly at their margins, certain organisms bioluminescent at night, and cities that grow upward in spirals of stone and glass, following in architectural tradition that prefers height to spread the light. In the medical bay is the same pale blue I have come to associate with interior spaces, cool and steady like the inside of a cold ocean at midnight. My arm has healed. The cut above my left eye is a thin line that will probably remain. My right side still aches when the air pressure shifts, which happens more frequently on Velen than on most inhabited worlds because of the atmospheric tidal pull of its two moons, both of which are visible from my window. In the long twilight hours, I read while I recovered. I studied. I mapped the layout of the royal household facility and noted its security architecture and access points, not because I was assigned here yet, but because the habit of preparation does not switch off because the immediate crisis has passed. It simply redirects. The next thing that might go wrong is always somewhere ahead of the last thing that did. Old habits, useful habits. The political fallout from Orth moved quickly. The navigation officer Veloth was taken into custody by Dominion intelligence within 36 hours of our return, identified through the forensic analysis of the armor frequency data alongside the communication record I had found on the ship. He had provided the technical information to a private contractor operating on behalf of a faction within the noble house that supported one of Savali's rival succession candidates. The contractor team at the station was identified and detained by the third day. The noble house is currently under formal investigation by the Dominion's Governance Council, a process that will take considerably longer but whose conclusion is not seriously in doubt. Savali's political position, which the attack was intended to weaken by creating the appearance of vulnerability, emerged significantly stronger. She had been seen surviving a coordinated attempt on her life in front of representatives of 11 delegations. She had been seen returning to the carrier composed and functional. She had been seen the following day in a formal statement naming the investigation formally and calling for its full conclusion without exception. She had done all of this clearly and publicly and without the kind of visible distress that political opponents could interpret as instability. She also formally petitioned the Galactic Alliance Council within 48 hours of returning to Velner space to reclassify Humanity's Protective Services Corps to first-tier Guardian status equal in the register to any species currently holding that designation. The petition included a formal written account of events at Orth and a specific argument that the standard species capability assessments used to determine Guardian tier ratings were inadequate because they measured physical characteristics and overlooked the particular human traits that had made the difference in that corridor outside Berth 7. The petition caused a significant reaction. Several council members viewed it as a diplomatic gesture of excessive warmth, the kind of overly generous public thank you that governments occasionally make after a crisis when they want to signal allied closeness. Others viewed it as a calculated political statement about Say's own judgment, demonstrating her ability to recognize and reward genuine capability. A few smaller delegations were privately concerned that elevating Humanity first-tier status would shift certain competitive balances in the protective services market that they had grown comfortable with. None of them understood that Savali had done it because it was accurate. She had not made a diplomatic gesture. She had corrected a classification error. There is a difference, and she was the kind of person who found imprecision in formal records genuinely irritating. She came to see me on the 4th day of my stay in the medical facility after the first phase of the formal hearings had concluded and the immediate political wave had passed its highest point. She came alone, which I was told by the staff was uncommon. WNER royalty did not typically move through a facility without a formation around them, even Informally, even in a secure environment, she sat down across from me, not across the room, not standing above me while I sat, which would have been the more natural posture difference, given our height difference and the power differential of our respective positions. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down so that we were at eye level. I looked it up. Afterward, informal Vellner social etiquette, the deliberate choice to sit at eye level with someone who is lower in station or in a position of physical recovery is a specific and recognized act. It communicates that the person making the gesture has chosen to reduce the distance voluntarily. It is not done casually. It is not a reflex. It is a choice, and the choice means something. I noted it and said nothing about it. I have been thinking, she said, about the conversation we had in the docking berth. Yes, I said I had been incorrect in my assessment of your capability. Yes, that was accurate, but it was not the most important correction. She looked at her hands for a moment, which was the first time I had seen her look at anything other than the person she was addressing during a significant exchange. I asked you whether you could protect me. That question has an implicit framework built into it. Could is a question about your physical reality, your training, your specifications measured against the threat. It is the question you ask when you are assessing a tool. I waited. You are not a tool, she said, and that framing missed the actual variable entirely. The actual question was whether you would weather the assignment, carried weight for you beyond its professional requirements, whether the word yes was binding in a way that extended past the moment of saying it. She looked up. I know the answer now, but I did not understand when I asked the original question what kind of answer I was actually asking for. I was asking the wrong thing entirely. The answer would have been the same either way. I said, I know that is the point. She looked at me steadily. For you, the question of would was never in question. There was never a version of events in which you would have done the minimum and called it sufficient because you said yes, and for you that closes the discussion. Yes, that is not how my people understand humans, he said. The diplomatic briefings describe your species as driven by self-interest, by survival priority, by cost-benefit reasoning in the service of individual preservation. It is not an unkind assessment. It is simply wrong, or at least it is incomplete in a way that makes it functionally wrong. Briefings describe statistics, I said. They describe what an average can predict. They are not good at describing what a promise means to the specific person who made it. She nodded slowly. I am going to change the briefing, she said, not just the Dominions, the Council's every assessment document in the formal record that describes humanity as a self-preserving, calculating species. It is missing the most important thing about you. What will you replace it with? She thought for a moment. Her markings were fully bright, steady, and even the way they were when she was fully present and thinking clearly. Species that gives weight to its own words, she said. A species that once it has said yes does not revisit the question. A species that has apparently survived long enough to reach the stars, in significant part by refusing to stop when stopping would have been easier. She paused. That is not self-interest. That is something else, something the standard assessments do not have a category for. We call it stubbornness, I said, or loyalty or honor. The word varies depending on which tradition you come from, we have a word for it in Old Velner. He said it translates roughly as the weight of a spoken thing. It is an archaic concept. We do not use it much in modern usage because we consider ourselves to have evolved past the era when spoken commitments carried force in the way the old literature describes. Slight pause. I am reconsidering that assessment as well. I almost smiled. I kept it contained. She stood, the movement smooth and unhurried, and she stood at full height, which in a velour medical bay was appropriate to the ceiling clearance and was not intimidating in the context of everything that had passed between us. You will be formally assigned the Royal Household Security Staff as a permanent attaché beginning at the conclusion of your recovery period, she said, back to the precise and formal tone of official communication. The commission transfer and rank upgrade have been processed through Colonel V. Haynes' office. I spoke with her directly. How did that conversation go? A very slight change in Savali's expression, something that in a Velner face occupied the space that a human smile occupies, but quieter and more controlled. She said she expected this outcome from the day she gave you the assignment. She also said to tell you that she wants the field kit you borrowed in the third rotation returned. Before your transfer processes, I felt something warm and familiar settle in my chest. Petrovane had been my co for 4 years. She had the specific quality of someone who never says more than they mean and always means more than they say, expecting this outcome from the day she gave me the assignment was coming from her, the most comprehensive endorsement I had ever received. Savali walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, not quite turned around, her profile visible. The question I asked you on the ship, she said, when we first met. Yes, I understand now why you only said yes, without explanation or argument or attempt to convince me. Does it make sense to you? I asked. She turned slightly, just enough that I could see the full brightness of her markings. Person who truly means yes does not explain it, she said. Explaining yes is what you do when you're trying to persuade someone who needs convincing. You were not trying to convince me. You already knew what the answer was and what it meant. The explanation was unnecessary because the decision had already been made, and the making of it was the entirety of what mattered. She left the door closed, and the pale blue light of the medical bay settled back to its quiet, steady state. And outside the window, the twin moons of Velshan were both visible, hanging in the long twilight sky above a planet that had never had a human being in it until very recently, and was in the process of adjusting to that fact. I looked at them for a while, the moons in the sky and the city spiraling upward in the distance, in the specific beautiful way that things build themselves when they have had enough time and enough patience. Colonel Vane's message had come through 2 days after I arrived at Velian, brief, as her messages always were. It said expected, it said proud, which was not a word she used often and which meant more for its rarity. It said come back in one piece when the assignment ends, which was the phrase she used to close every message to people currently posted in the field, and which was her way of saying that she intended for them to continue existing and considered that outcome worth expressing. I wrote back and told her I was well and that the assignment was permanent and that I would be keeping the field kit because it had saved my life in a maintenance tunnel on Orth, and It deserved to stay with me, she wrote. Back, fair enough, bring it back. Eventually, I keep that message, I keep most of her messages. They are the record of a professional relationship that has mattered to me in ways that formal record keeping does not capture. And I have learned over the years that the things worth keeping are worth keeping intentionally rather than by accident. My new assignment begins officially in 4 days, when the medical clearance is issued and the paperwork is complete, and I walk out of this pale blue room into a planet I have never lived on before, in a role I have never held before, serving a person who had to survive an assassination attempt, to understand what I was, and who has in my assessment understood it very thoroughly. Since then, I looked at them for a while, the moons in the sky and the city spiraling upward in the distance, the specific beautiful way that things build themselves when they have had enough time and enough patience. My arm did not hurt anymore. My side was getting there. The line above my eye would stay, which I found I did not mind. Lines like that are not decorations, they are records. Every one of them is a moment where the outcome could have been different and was not. And the difference was a decision made in the fraction of a second before thought caught up with action. I had been in this work for 11 years. In 11 years, I had made a significant number of those decisions. I expected to make a significant number more. The galaxy has a picture of humanity that it built from the parts of us it could measure, our height in our lifespan and our relatively recent arrival among the stars, our apparently average physical specifications compared to the combat specialized species that have been out here for centuries, our tendency to negotiate, to adapt, to find a way through problems by methods that do not always look like the methods the galaxy's strategic models predict. The picture is not entirely wrong. We are not the largest species or the longest lived or the most physically formidable. Those things are all true. The picture is wrong about what that means, because the thing about humans, the thing that the briefing documents and the capability assessments and the diplomatic summaries keep missing is not in our physical specifications at all. It is in what happens when one of us says yes to something. When a human makes a promise, it does not become a contract to be honored when convenient. It does not become an obligation to be discharged at minimum cost. It becomes a fact about how the world is going to go. It becomes the answer to every subsequent question about whether to continue, whether to keep going, whether the situation justifies stopping. Those questions stop being relevant. The promise is the answer to all of them. Already given, already final. That is not in any briefing document I have ever read about my species. It is not in the capability assessments or the strategic profiles or the alliance negotiations. It is in the reason a soldier from a coastal town in the north of England spent 3 years learning an alien language for a posting he had not been given yet, and memorized the corridors of a station he had not been assigned to yet, and disagreed with a security rating in a note that changed nothing except his own preparation. It is in the corridor outside berth 7 in a service tunnel under the floors of a diplomatic station, in a moment on a ship at the end of a long day, when a princess with dim markings asked a question she thought was hard. She thought it was hard because she was asking about capability, about specifications, about The tool and whether the tool was sufficient, she did not understand that. She was not talking to a tool, she was talking to someone who had already given his answer fully and finally the moment the word yes left his mouth, someone for whom the outcome after that was not a question of capability but a question of will, and for whom the question of will had been resolved the same instant the question was asked. That is what she did not understand, standing in the doorway of a medical bay on a planet that orbits a star 60 light years from the town where I was born, watching twin moons rise slowly in a twilight that lasts 4 hours on this world. I think about all the things the galaxy is still learning about us, about all the assessments it will have to revise, about all the moments in corridors and service tunnels and docking berths in places no one has mapped yet, where another human is going to give another answer and then do the thing they said they would do. We are patient. We have always been patient. We will keep showing up and doing the work and keeping the promises we make, and the galaxy will keep being surprised, and that is completely fine. We are used to being underestimated. We have been underestimated since before we knew there was anyone else out here to do the estimating. We are still here. We will keep being here. That is the whole of the answer. That is all the explanation it needs.